doing report.
This meeting is being recorded.
Has been working for a long time with us to provide coverage of issues related to the environment in North Carolina, and wrote the series that we published, I guess it was 2 weeks ago now, Fraught Forests, focusing on the same issues we're going to be talking about tonight. Also on our panel is Marquette Crockett, who is the Roan Stewardship Director with the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy. David Easterling, who is the Chief Climate Assessments Section Director at the NCA Technical Support Unit at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, that's NOAA. Lang Hornthal, who is the co-executive director of the nonprofit group Ecoforesters, which is an Asheville-based nonprofit forestry organization that's dedicated to conserving and restoring Appalachian forests. And Lisa Jennings with U.S. Forest Service, who is recreation manager at the Grandfather Ranger District. Thanks to all of you. And let's go ahead and get into some of the great questions that we have had submitted, as well as some that came from our journalists. A question that really was asked by quite a few people, and I think it's a good way to start. It's a lot of what we talked about in the series, but just to kind of sum it up, and I'll start out with Jack on this, but perhaps I definitely would like others to jump in too. Just simply, if we're in Western North Carolina, what impact can we actually, what basic impacts can we expect to see from climate change? Let's say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. What are we expecting?
Yeah, I would say two things whenever someone asks me that question, which comes up a lot more in conversation. I think the one thing that we know is the climate is definitely warming. So that trend is going up. But I would also say this, and there's still a great deal of uncertainty of what that future looks like. I guess the further out that we look into the future, the more uncertainty that is. And, you know, to quote David, I think, you know, business as usual could be problematic, but, you know, maybe we're on the verge of making some significant changes. I may be a little bit skeptical of that, but those are the two things that I would say. We're facing a warmer climate here in Western North Carolina, of course, all over the globe, and the impact will be slightly different depending on where we are.
Some of the rest of you like to address that as well.
Yeah, I'd be glad to jump in. This is David. So along with that warming, you have changes in other parts of the climate system. And one of the major impacts is going to be more water vapor in the atmosphere, because as the atmosphere warms up, it can hold more moisture. And as a result, you end up getting more heavy precipitation events, like what happened with Tropical Storm Fred last year and in Canton and that area, where we had huge amount of rain dropped in over a period of about 12 hours that led to a lot of flooding. So warming, it's not just the warming, but it's some of the other changes that we'll be seeing in the future. And, you know, what will the future look like? You know, that's exactly correct. We don't know what the future emissions pathways are going to be. When I say emissions, is how much greenhouse gases are going to be put into the atmosphere. As we begin to reduce emissions, hopefully in the future, that will minimize some of the impact, but it'll still be
there. This leads me to a question that I came out of the people who read our series were really intrigued by something we talked about. And I'll probably start with Marquette on this question, but people are really interested in microclimates. As we talked about what's happening with areas like the Roan Highlands, where there is a threat potentially with climate change to particularly isolated climate zones where species could be lost to climate change. Could you talk about that with us a little bit, about what those risks are?
Yeah, I guess just really basically first to sort of think about a microclimate, because it's easy to kind of envision what that might be. Diversity in all things is good. And here in the Southern Appalachians, we have a diversity of elevation and slope and vegetation and aspect. And so, for example, you may have a south-facing slope that's very warm, but within that slope, you may have a deep ravine that's shaded by conifer, and that thus creates a cooler microclimate on a really tiny scale that can sustain, you know, potentially, for example, rare salamander species. In the specific example of the Roan Highlands, because of their elevation, they're much cooler than the surrounding area. If you guys saw Jack's pictures, we were really cold in April. And, so it can be 15 to 20 degrees colder than surrounding areas. And because of that, it supports boreal forest communities, similar to what Lisa's probably familiar with over on the Grandfather District. So spruce fir, grassy bald, lots of species that are rare in our region because they are confined to those high elevations. And for those specific species, there's really nowhere for them to go. So in the face of climate change, they're looking at things, for example, like assisted migration for plant species that they know won't be able to survive. But for us as land managers, we look at trying to preserve the health and the expanse of those communities as much as we can so they can be as resilient as possible.
Thank you. Anybody else want to talk with us a little bit about microclimate areas as well? A related question in some ways, as we talk about diversity being desirable, I think we also saw in some of the reporting, there's one type of diversity that we don't want, which is invasive species. And there's certainly a concern about that. And I thought I might start with Lang on that. Can you talk a little bit about the concerns presented by invasive species? And I realize it could be both flora and fauna that present some threats to our native environment.
Sure. Well, as everyone can appreciate, we have a rich history of invasive pests, plants, pathogens, starting with the American chestnut and seeing what it can be like to remove a species from an ecosystem and on a large landscape and the impacts you can see over time. So we're seeing it now with the emerald ash borer, how it can just come in and just completely eradicate a species or do irreparable harm. Invasive plants have been here a long time. And over 40, 50, 60 years, they have slowly outcompeted and find themselves in a dominant position. In you speaking earlier about what is the future going to look like, I think we can all agree that disturbance, we're going to expect disturbance of some kind, whether it is fire, whether it's flooding, high winds. And I like to think of forestry in a very simple term as the management of light, and that all living things are competing for this light, including trees and plants. And whenever there's disturbance, that opens up a whole suite of possibilities for plants and trees that are just waiting for that sunlight. And invasive plants are very good at getting themselves in a position to not only take advantage of disturbance, but also create disturbance themselves. And so it's a really big problem now that they are here and that they are established, and we are expecting an increase in disturbance on the landscape.
I had a number of questions from people about the issue of logging, and it's interesting. I think there's a lot of assumption out there that logging is just bad. Certainly, if we were to cut down all of the forests, we wouldn't have much left. But I understand from conversations with many of you and with Jack through the years that there are pros and cons, and there's a lot of arguments about the right method of forest management and the role that logging can play. I thought I might start with Lisa on this question. What are some of the complicated issues around logging?
Yeah, we think about how the forest is changing over time. And one of the things that you mentioned is diversity is helpful, right? So a diversity of species, but also a diversity of age classes in our forests. What we know is that the forest that is regenerating now is not the same that is the forest that was regenerating 50 years ago. Plants and trees are pretty resilient, especially if you can control invasives. What comes back tends to be stuff that's more resilient in the future. Not all the time, but generally as those site conditions change. So we do see logging as a tool to create those diversity of age classes that will make a forest more resilient. We also have, a lot of kind of this relic of past logging where we're seeing all of these patches of forest that are about the same age. We have places where we still have planted species like plantations of white pine. And when you have those thick forests all at the same age with a pretty, similar species type, those are the forests that are most susceptible to insects and disease, to fire, to other things coming in. So logging can be used as a tool to help create diverse forests.
What about some of the concerns about logging and what types of controls we would see as desirable to limit logging and where they should be?
Yeah, and I will say, my background is forest management, but at this point, I'm a recreation manager, so I can only speak from my experience in forestry and in restoration. And so we know on national forests, the type of logging that we do these days is not a wholesale clear-cut logging. We're doing, selective logging for specific species or specific desired conditions that look at the future types. And so a mosaic of that across the landscape is the desired condition. And, having controls in place that make sure that we're keeping those old growth patches that are really critical to preserve species while having that diversity of age classes in the appropriate places, the right treatment for the right landscape in the right place.
I'll jump in also, Frank. I think logging on public lands is a very, it causes a lot of emotion, and people have care very deeply about our public lands. I think one of the interesting thing about Jack's article is he brought up the point that almost 70% of our forests in Western North Carolina are privately owned. And this article was about our forests of Western North Carolina. So it's important to remember we have all these private landowners who are making decisions on a daily basis about their forests, or sometimes not making decisions at all, that are impacting all the things that we value about our forests. If it's water filtration and storage, or carbon sequestration, or recreation, wildlife, all the things that we get to benefit from are often happening because of the actions of private landowners. And Ecoforesters works one-on-one with landowners across the spectrum, but the number one thing we hear are people want to do right by their forests, but they also want the ability to manage for what they value most about their forest. And as we see on the national forest, everyone values a forest for different reasons. And if you are a private landowner and you value for being able to hunt, or to cut firewood, or to send your kids to college because you're anticipating a timber harvest in the next 10 years. These are all things that a private landowner should be able to do. But what's important is that they are given the tools and the opportunity to do those things in a way that's ecologically minded, and in a way that's not going to be detrimental to future forest health. I think we all agree, if we look back over the past couple hundred years of our country and how we've grown through the Industrial Revolution and how we have utilized our natural resources, that I don't think there's anybody on this Zoom who wouldn't say, if I could go back and shake some people and tell them not to do things like they were doing them, absolutely. We can see it. We see it in our oceans. We see it in our forests. And we wish we could go back and do it differently. I do believe that the forest product industry is very much aware of how their past management has impacted our current conditions. And they have been active partners in wanting to make a difference, whether if it's through certification or helping landowners to find resources to be able to ecologically manage their forests.
Jack, I know we had talked about inviting, and we did invite, but the person was not able to join us this evening. Somebody who's with the organization, the group that has had the longest experience of managing forests in Western North Carolina, thousands of years of experience, and that's the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians. I'm just interested, I know you've done some reporting on this. What are some of the lessons for forest management that can be learned from conversations? I know the U.S. Forest Service has talked in particular with the Eastern Band about their techniques of managing the forest through the centuries.
Yeah, I think personally, I think one of the most exciting things about the forest plan is the inclusion of, using traditional ecological knowledge, as they call it, but tapping into what the Cherokee bring to the table. And they have so much knowledge and obviously just a completely different perspective. And not only that, they manage 50,000 acres of forest in the Qualla boundary. I think that number's about right. But I think what is, I'm no expert at all on this, but they have a very long-term view of managing forests and plants and other things that they derive value from for cultural reasons or maybe even economic reasons. But I think they have a 7-generation outlook. And here we are, the forest plan, or maybe even an individual's plan, has a very distinct time constraint on it. And so I think that's something that they bring to the table that is really fascinating and really forces you to think about the complexity of managing forests and the different ways out there that there may be to do it.
And that raises a question, a really good question I have from somebody is, can we just walk people through the different types of ownership we see with forests in Western North Carolina? So I'm just, the ones that jump out at my mind as a resident of this area for about 7 years now. Obviously, we have the national forests, we have some state forests, we have national parks, including the Blue Ridge Parkway, which is my favorite commute route of all time. We have some, I mentioned state parks, and of course we have the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. We've got a number of other public lands. We have some county and city lands as well that are forested. I know there's a lot of private interest. What am I missing? What are some additional ones out there that we want to think about as we think about this massive mix of land in Western North Carolina?
Go ahead, Marquette.
I will jump in, Frank, to say conservancies.
Absolutely.
And the Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy has protected more than 75,000 acres in Western North Carolina and East Tennessee. So, and I think it's important for folks to understand that we do that through a variety of tools. So we may own some of those properties, buy those properties from willing sellers. Folks may donate their land to us, but by far one of the most popular tools in our toolbox is a conservation easement. And that may be on forest land, that may be on farmland, but that's a restriction on a private land that allows that landowner use of their property. They're allowed to sell their property. They're allowed to do, forestry if it's addressed in the conservation easement. But what it doesn't allow them to do is then sell that to be a subdivision later. So that's a huge, huge tool to protect our land and keep our landscape looking relatively like it does today. And that's what we work really hard to do across the region. So.
Great. And I know we've got a range of individual owners out there as well who maybe are not part of conservancies, but are interested in what can I do with my little bit of property in some cases. And an interesting question from somebody said, say that I only own 5 acres of property. What can I do? Especially thinking about the threat of climate change right now. Any thoughts there?
I'll jump in just real quick. Just to say, I am also a teeny landowner. And really, I think the first step is to stop thinking about that boundary and think of what you have as a piece of the whole, because we really have to look at the entire landscape in our region to do good management. And then I think you work with folks like Lang, and I'll let him, speak to that. But to really just manage for quality and quantity and bountifulness on your own property, whether that's forest health and treating invasive species, whether that's growing your own food and reducing that carbon footprint when you go to the grocery store, just really thinking about how that property can be best utilized. And I don't know, Lang, if you want.
That's you said it great, and I think non-native invasive plants are impacting every landowner of any size. I mean, you can drive down the highway and see them on the side of the road. If you have a half acre, there's a good chance you might have a non-native invasive plant in your yard. So just having an awareness of what those plants are, what you can do if you have them, and how to treat them. But I'd also throw in, I think a neat thing to do if you're a 5-acre landowner is just be aware of what's going on in your forest. And it's easy to admire the trees that are in the canopy and see this majestic oak or pine that might be in there. But it's important to pay attention to the little trees that are in there too, because that's your future forest. And you want to be thinking about what is important to me as a 5-acre landowner or a 500-acre landowner, and how can we, by planning and by an awareness of what's going to come up when there is disturbance, be prepared to have that resilient forest that everyone keeps acknowledging it makes for a diverse forest and resilient forest.
David, in the first article in our series, we talked a lot about the effect of whipsawing the forest with the weather, the erratic weather that can come from climate change. Could you talk to us a little bit about the dynamics of climate change? And it's not, and obviously we're talking about warming, but my understanding is this doesn't always, when we see it in terms of actual weather, it's sometimes wild swings, hot and cold, wet and dry. Can you talk to us a little bit about that and how that relates to climate change?
Sure. Like I said before, climate change is not just warming. It's going to be impacting other parts of the climate system. It's going to be impacting tropical cyclones, for example. We had Fred last year that came up from the Gulf of Mexico, and the Gulf of Mexico is warming the sea surface temperatures, and that's where these storms get their energy, is through evaporation off of the oceans. And so, it's impacting those kinds of storms. It's likely impacting even thunderstorms and convective storms. We haven't, those are at a scale that our climate models don't really resolve them. But we do resolve the environment where these kinds of storms develop. And so we do see these sorts of changes as the climate warms up. Like I said, it can hold more moisture. But the other part of it is it's going to increase evapotranspiration or evaporation. And that's it may not in our area necessarily lead to more droughts, but when we do have droughts, they can end up intensifying fairly rapidly because of this increase in temperature and increase in evaporation. And we end up with situations like what happened in Gatlinburg, I think it was 2016, where we had very rapid drying out in the fall. That's kind of a dry season anyway around here. And that led to wildfires. And we're likely to see that sort of thing happen more often as the climate warms up. So you kind of get these wild swings. You get a lot of rainfall that can lead to flash flooding and that sort of thing. But then you can have it suddenly cut off and go for 2 or 3 weeks or even longer where you don't have much rainfall at all. Soils dry out, all the understory, all the litter in the forest dries out, and that creates a potential for a wildfire. So that's the sort of thing we're looking at, is kind of these wild swings, more heat waves, possibly even more cold waves. People, it sounds counterintuitive, but one of the things that we're looking at is how what we call a warming or polar amplification of the climate system. You're getting more warming in the very high latitudes in the poles. Well, you've heard of the term polar vortex. Well, what that really is just the jet streams up there, the upper level winds that are encircling the pole. When they're very strong, they keep that cold air locked up at the pole. But as they weaken, because you get the temperature gradient between the tropics and the poles is less, that leads to weaker winds and sort of curvier upper level winds, and allows these cold waves to kind of like what happened in Texas last year. Suddenly you get this incursion of cold air because the upper level winds are not as strong as they used to be. So there are a lot of different parts of the climate system that are impacted by this increase in greenhouse gases. It's not just temperature. It's a lot of other things, storms, heavy rainfall events, lots of different things.
Lisa, as you talked with us for the series about the area that you're focusing on managing, I sense that weather events can really be disruptive for your work.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're seeing that more intense, frequent rainfall, right? Kind of unpredictable rainfall cycles, right? So you have a longer period of drought, and in this area, especially during wildfire season, we say a week without rain is kind of this like micro drought, right? The soils dry up enough, and then you get these intense rainfall events where, in the past in this area, we were seeing more of these long soaking rains, that nice light rain. And now we're getting these intense rainfall events, and you're seeing more impacts to our infrastructure system. You're seeing the rivers rise faster because of that intensity, which is leading to, the stuff that we saw in Crusoe and in the area near for the hurricane this past fall. And so it's a big impact on our infrastructure and makes us think about, as land managers, how we design for the future. And I would say that's the same for homeowners, right? The floodplains that we mapped long ago are not the floodplains of the future. And we're seeing that everywhere. Luckily, on national forests, we have a good, healthy forest that does soak up quite a bit of that water when it comes down. If you look, in the past when the forests were acquired, a lot of that land wasn't forested. But you take that to an urban area where you suddenly lose that forest that soaks it in, you're seeing those higher flood impacts, and especially lower down in the watershed.
Yeah, I know we saw that in some other reporting we did. We were looking at it for a different reason this year, but the city of Brevard in particular has really had to look at what they're doing with flood control, and their rainfall numbers are just way up in recent years. We think about what happened in Crusoe in Haywood County after Fred, but it's not like that's an isolated event. We saw people losing their property and their lives with mudslides or landslides as a result of that. We saw the same thing just a few years earlier down in Polk County with another storm that came through there. And I know there's been other incidents throughout the region. So it's
Frank, if I could just share an anecdote that does connect some of these dots. Doing some reporting earlier today, I was on the phone with a source who is in Transylvania County, and he is spending a lot of time. His business involves putting people on the water, so keeping the French Broad open is important to him. And I hadn't quite realized this, but the West Fork and the North Fork of the French Broad River saw a significant amount of rain, not flash flooding, but over the Memorial Day weekend, a significant amount of rain. And what that rain brought down were a lot of dead hemlocks, and those hemlocks are blocking the stream. And the hemlocks are, of course, a victim of an invasive. And so I just thought it was interesting. I don't know if the rain event, and David, maybe you can chime in on this. I don't know if you end up ever tracking how much rain fell, and it wasn't a flash flood event, but it was obviously a big event over time. Is that related to climate change? Like, what connection? Can you help distinguish the weather from the climate in a situation like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I live in North Henderson County. We got a lot of rain. I'm actually an observer for one of our networks, and I'd have to go back and look. I probably got close to 3 inches of rain over the week or so before Memorial Day. So, all that rain eventually is going to run off, and it's going to cause, it may not cause flash flooding where you have really, really high waters, but, if I go and look at the French Broad River where 191 goes across it, fields are just flooded out there. They flood quite frequently now. What's really amazing is, some of these fields are planted with tomatoes or whatever, and you look out there in the middle of summer after we've had one of these long periods of rain, and they're 3 feet of water on them. So there are a lot of sort of impacts like that it's not necessarily flash flooding where you have a huge wall of water coming down like what happened in Crusoe, but it's this sort of more systemic flooding that you're getting from these streams, where you have a period, a week long, kind of longer rain like that. And that's again symptomatic of the fact that we have seen warming in western North Carolina, and atmospheric water vapor is increasing in this area like it is in pretty much everywhere else in the world where it's warmed.
Another interesting thing, and I'm going to shut my video off. It's saying that my systems are low, so maybe this will help out. But it's saying it's interesting that when you think about water, we also should be thinking about what trees are in our forests and how much water they're using. The same outfitter that Jack referenced likes to talk about how in the springtime, when the leaves start to first come out, and the trees start to uptake more water and resources, he can actually see in areas where they're heavy on poplar, he can actually see the water levels drop because of so much intake as compared to oak. And Lisa, you might know this answer better than I, but I want to say poplar uses over twice as much, maybe even more water than oaks.
Yeah, exactly. Poplars and maples use about twice as much water as our oaks and dry species like pines. So it's really a process that we, in the tree science call messification, where you're having these species that's moved in to areas that are typically kind of drier sites, and they use a lot more water, and they're soaking up that water and changing how the forest reacts. It's a really interesting change in our forest based on fire exclusion, death of the chestnuts, climate change, and all these complicated factors combined.
I've had a number of questions come up in the chat, and I want to get to one now that is interesting. There's a lot of interest in the concern about old growth, mature forest public lands, and certainly, we want to think about them in relation to preserving the larger forest and how climate change is affecting them. And they're also very concerned about urban growth threatening some of these types of forests. Some of you like to talk to those concerns.
Boy, Frank, that is a can of worms right there. But I have been following the chat, and yeah, I think I guess I'll say a couple things is, and we were alluding to this earlier, but we think about forests, we have to balance them ecologically and make them right, to the best understanding that we have. And we don't know all the science. There's so much uncertainty, but there is social, there's a huge social function to trees. It's very emotional to people. That's why when you bring up logging or timber activities, it's very emotional to people. We all love trees, and there's really, a clear cut, or even any forestry or logging activity looks, it doesn't look great. And so it brings up a lot of emotions. And, we are blessed to have an enormous amount of old growth. And I think we really do need to have, one thing that inspires me to report is to help people understand not that I understand it fully, but to help convey the science and also the values that people have. There's just no one right answer. I think there's some great cases to say, let's not touch this part of the forest, like let's let it thrive. But I think there are also good arguments scientifically to say, hey, this is an area that we need to improve. So I guess those are my two comments, but I just think old growth is such an interesting issue to talk about. We should have another panel just on that.
Well, and I'll just jump in to say, Jack, I think it's interesting. It's an interesting topic as well, because old growth is a term that can be defined a lot of different ways depending on who you're talking to. So are we speaking about just mature forests? Or are we speaking about those extraordinary, hundreds of year old trees? How is that term defined? I think makes a huge difference to the conversation. But I will say, just from the Conservancy point of view, we're pretty hands off with forest management. unless, of course, it is something we're doing to help with forest health. And so, and then I'll also say that urban development, I mean, that's something we're directly working on all the time. And there's no better cure for a lot of that urban development than good planning and an active community who is engaged in that planning can just make all the difference when it comes to those things as well. So just throwing that out there.
Yeah, and I'll just add on a little bit. You know, I talked about kind of that mosaic of forest types across the landscape. Diversity is something we're always looking for. And I can't, you know, speak as a representative of timber management in the Forest Service, but a couple things that I would say is that, the U.S. Forest Service is a multi-use agency, and forest management and timber is a part of that management that that is part of what the Forest Service does as a tool in our toolbox. But kind of bringing it back to some of those connections actually with the forest plan and the Cherokee, another really important tool in our toolbox is prescribed fire. And this is something that if you look at historical texts of forests in the area, they describe a forest that is open with a grassy understory. And if you guys have walked in the woods, which I've been doing a lot lately, it's not necessarily open in a lot of places. It's full of rhododendron and mountain laurel and very thick, and you don't get that herbaceous, lush understory. And that's not wholesale, but that's in these areas that are maybe less healthy. And a tool that we can use that's not logging, is prescribed fire. And that's something that we're lucky here in the South to have that cultural history of prescribed fire use. I heard the forest supervisor say this year that we used prescribed fire on more acres just in National Forest in North Carolina than all of the national forests did in the state of California. And if we talk about increased wildfire frequency in the future and the ways that we have to make our forests more resilient to that large scale disturbance, low intensity prescribed fire on the landscape is one of the best tools we can use. And I extend that even to private landowners who have land that is appropriate for that. There's a lot of resources in the state that help protect the home, help increase the health and diversity of the forest. And that's a tool that's been used for millennia on the landscape.
One of the questions we mentioned early on, and I want to come back to kind of the same thought. People are saying, what can we do? And the person in particular was thinking as a landowner, but just thinking as a resident of the region or as an interested party. Maybe we have people who are not in Western North Carolina, but are very interested in Western North Carolina. Somebody put it this way. They said, other than voting, and I would say maybe other than also watching your carbon footprint, what can we do? What can we do about these problems we're talking about to protect our forests and our habitats just as average residents?
Vote, donate, volunteer, come pull invasive species with us, advocate for those urban majestic trees, be involved in your community. That's why we all get up in the morning, I think. Responsible planning when it comes to development, responsible planning when it comes to forestry. Those things are so critical to moving forward in this sort of climate crisis that I just think anything that folks can do to be involved in those processes, they should be.
I'll throw something in there, and I wish it was as concise and easy to do as Marquette just said, but the number one barrier for landowners across the board, national forest, state forest, land trust, private landowners, of why they struggle with forest stewardship is funding. And no one has a deep enough budget line item to do all of the stewardship and restoration work that is needed across the landscape in our forests. And so I think if we can support any incentives that allow for that stewardship to happen, support the organizations that are doing the work, and I guess to get back to the get out and vote, we should pressure our representatives to support that state agencies like Extension or the North Carolina Forest Service that are just woefully understaffed and under budget to help them get the resources that they need, because these are the people that historically are helping private landowners. You know, Extension was created to get scientific research and information out to private landowners. And right now there are 2 Extension forestry agents, I believe, in order to cover all 100 counties in North Carolina. Had a conversation with the state forester who said, I think there were 25 or 30 positions that almost stay open in Western North Carolina because they have such a hard time keeping foresters. So talk to your representative about, if you support conservation and if you support active stewardship, then we need to support more funding for those things as well.
I think that's a really good point. It's one thing to vote, but if you, besides just voting, letting your representatives know that you're concerned about these issues, it may not be on their radar in the same way if they don't hear from their constituents about some of these concerns. This thinking about the state actually brings us to a question that I thought was interesting. We focused a lot on the U.S. Forest Service, picking on Lisa a little bit, and we've talked about Conservancy and private efforts a lot. Somebody wanted to know, what are some of the strategies that the state of North Carolina is involved in, specifically in Western North Carolina, to protect forests?
Well, yeah, that's a good question. This may be a little bit unrelated, but David, I wonder if you might be able to speak to the state climate plan a little bit and what's involved with that. And I know it's broad, it goes way beyond forests, but I do think it's interesting to note that our administration in the state is on the radar.
Yeah, that's right. The governor requested, well, they actually requested our group to do the North Carolina climate assessment as a part of the overall plan, which would include things like, moving vehicles to more electric vehicles and that sort of thing. But we did do a North Carolina climate assessment. So the group that I run is actually composed mainly of NC State University employees. We have it's called a cooperative institute, where we give them funding and then they hire scientists. And so we produced a comprehensive assessment of climate change and potential some impacts for North Carolina, and released it about a year and a half ago or so. And that was just one part of the governor's climate action plan, which I've read parts of it. Like I said, it's trying to encourage more renewables, wind energy, solar energy, as well as moving at least the state vehicle fleet to more electric cars, electric vehicles, and that sort of thing. But then also trying to just simply reduce emissions, better gas mileage, all that sort of thing. And I must admit, the last time I read it was quite a while ago, but those are the main things that stick in my mind.
I noticed, Lang, you shared a link with us. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, this is a link to the North Carolina Forest Action Plan, and they are required to update this. I believe it's every 10 years. We are in an exciting time in the world of forest management for North Carolina for many reasons. We have this state action plan, which came out in 2020. The U.S. Forest Service is in the process of updating their plan. We are talking about climate change and all these challenges that forestry is facing that we have never had to anticipate before. An interesting part, we haven't even talked about recreation as a part of, I believe, Lisa, in the last U.S. Forest Service plan, mountain bikes were not even mentioned because it wasn't a thing. And they are now actively probably one of the greatest users on the national forest. So all this change is happening, and it's happening at a rapid pace. And so forest managers and land managers are trying desperately to plan with the best knowledge that they have and the best science that we have. And we've learned so much, not only from our mistakes, but just from all the great research and technology that's out there. So it's exciting to think about. I mean, it can be daunting to think about the challenges, but it's super exciting to think about the number of organizations that are committed to making a difference and helping keep our forests resilient.
Mhm.
You know, one question that we had also was about uses that are overuses. I just wonder, and Lisa, maybe you could be a good person for me to address this too. I know you work a lot with recreation in the National Forest. Are there concerns that there's some uses that people are involved in that are just, you know, too problematic? Are there some where we really have to clamp down on them and they're causing problems for us?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'll say first, you know, there's many uses of the National Forest that we manage every year. And like one example that just popped out is we stopped the ginseng lottery this year, right? Looking at ginseng on the National Forest, historically, we've issued permits. They monitor the populations every year and saw it got below a threshold, and they're taking a break from issuing those permits. So that's kind of one example in the forest products realm. Now in recreation, the Pisgah and Nantahala National Forests are the #1 recreation national forest in the entire country. So recreation is really what people think of, especially when they come to Pisgah, which is my territory. And I'm on the grandfather district east of Asheville. And so what we're seeing is overuse in certain areas that are more accessible, and then dispersed use in other areas that are less accessible. And there's kind of this management conundrum, right? Like, do you build and develop the most accessible areas, or do you spread out use across the forest? Because the one thing that's really important as a public land manager is to make sure that public lands are relevant for future generations. And the way people experience their public lands is through recreation and through a recreation infrastructure. I'm betting everybody on this call has hiked on a trail on national forests in Western North Carolina at some time in their life, right? And that might be why you're interested in forest health at some level. And so making sure that we're creating and maintaining a sustainable recreation system is really critical. And you see things like a new trail system in Old Fort that's very concentrated with a big parking area. That's that approach of hardening, where you provide the resources people need in an area that's accessible, that's sustainable. And then that kind of helps kind of focus that use so that you're not having those impacts spread across the forest, and it's easier to manage the any adverse effects that come with that.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for a very lively discussion that we've been at it for almost an hour now, and really appreciate it. And I want to thank AB Tech for sponsoring tonight's forum. And thank you for everybody who has attended and asked some great questions. And I'll turn it back over to Lisa Lopez at this point.
Yes, I want to reiterate. Thank you, Frank. Thank you so much, panelists, for your conversation this evening and for your expertise. It's, again, like I said in the beginning, it's been a very robust conversation, and we really look forward to continuing this. I want to remind all of our participants that if you will watch out for your email, there will be a recording. We have been recording this event, and so look for that email. We'll send everybody the recording so you can forward it to anyone that you think might be interested in this topic. Also, just a quick note, we have received funding from the Google News Initiative to look at or discover the news needs of North Carolinians through the lens of broadband in North Carolina, or lack thereof in certain areas of North Carolina. The lack of broadband is an issue. We are surveying. We have a survey that you're welcome to participate in. We'd love it. If you texted survey, the word survey, SURVEY, to 886 716-1266. And if you have any questions about that, please feel free to email me. I can give you more information about that. And again, just thank you all so much for being here and taking time out to join us this evening. And we look forward to engaging in the future. And thank you for being a part of Carolina Public Press. Thank you all so much. Have a good night.
Thanks to everyone.
Thank you for your reporting. We appreciate all you're doing.
Thanks, Lang.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jack.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Have a good evening.
Thanks, folks.